Hello, welcome to Zigmatech Learning Hub. I'll be your instructor for government. For this class, we are going to be taking our exercises from the Examguide app. If you don't have the application already installed on your device, I want you to download the app in order to follow along in this class. Examguide is a leading educational app that helps students prepare adequately for various exams like UTME, post-UTME, WEAC, GCE, KCPE, IJMB, JUPEB, BECE, SSCE, NCEE, NECO, etc. You can download the app from www.examguide.com or Google Play Store. Please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to be updated on new videos. Ready for today's class? Okay, let's get started. Now, today's topic, we are going to look at what we call delegated legislation, transferring lawmaking power. Now, specifically, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to state the meaning of delegated legislation, discuss the forms of delegated legislation, discuss how we can control delegated legislation, highlight the advantages and the disadvantages of delegated legislation. Now, let's go to the meaning of delegated legislation. Now, delegated legislation is defined as discretionary powers that are given by the legislature or any authoritative lawmaking body to local authorities and other government departments to act and make rules and regulations in the discharge of their duties. We also define it as the act of transferring powers and functions through the act of parliament to other organizations, such as the minister or ministry, local government, public corporations, etc. What we're saying here is this. Remember, when we taught you the arms of government or the structure of government, you learned that the legislative arm of government is the one responsible for lawmaking. So the lawmaking power or authority is with the legislature. Now, it may not be possible for other government bodies to always wait for the legislature to come up with rules and regulations in form of act of parliament or laws before they can carry out certain things in the discharge of their duties. So it becomes imperative that the legislature transfers lawmaking powers, discretionary powers to these agencies to be able to make some rules and regulations. And that is why in terms of acts of parliament establishing some of these agencies, they are given powers to make certain rules and regulations that will have the force of the law. But they are not actually acts of parliament. But these people have now been given power by the parliament to make some rules and regulations in the discharge of their duties. That is why you can see the Ministry of Education can come up with a pronouncement and which will be followed by the public. It's not a law made by the legislature, but it is having the force of the law because the legislature has given the ministry, other government departments and local authorities the power to make some discretionary rules and regulations for effectiveness of their duties or in the discharge of their duties. Now, so there are laws made by other bodies other than the legislature, but approved by the legislature. Now, let's look at the forms it can take. Now, we have number one, what we call statutory orders or instruments. What we mean by that? These are rules and orders made by the ministry or the department of government. So any rule, any regulation made by or pronouncement made by the department, the ministry. Example, you talk about Ministry of Education coming up with an educational policy that must be followed by the public or public institutions, public educations or schools. We call it statutory order or instrument. So any directive given, any rule given by the ministry through the minister, we call it statutory instrument or order. So it's a form of delegated legislation. Now, another form of delegated legislation is what we call provisional orders. Now, these are temporal general rules or orders from individuals or bodies authorized by the ministers. So we are talking about other government agencies or parastatals under the supervision of the ministry. So their rules and regulations, the order made by them, example, Nigeria National Petroleum Corporation or public corporations or other agencies, rules made by them are provisional orders. They are under a particular ministry and they are supervised by the minister. So rules made by them are what we call provisional orders. Now, we also have what we call order in council. Now, that's the power of the British monarch to make what we call royal proclamation in the private council when there is need to exercise unusual legislative powers in the country. Now, this is what we see in United Kingdom. Now, the British monarch has the power in the private council to sit and make a pronouncement during an emergency that does not require normal law-making process. And that proclamation will now have what we call a force of the law. But it is not a law made by the legislature. So the order in council applies to the United Kingdom. Now, there's another one we call what we call special or emergency orders. Now, that's the power of the chief executive of the state to make pronouncement that has the force of the law. Example, during the COVID period, we saw some states or some countries where the chief executive made pronouncements for lockdown. So, which everybody followed, complied with. So, during state of emergency, the executive has the power, the right to make a pronouncement that the public must be followed. Now, that pronouncement has the force of law, and that is why you see people can be punished, people can be detained for violating that special or emergency order. Now, we also have what we call bylaws. When you talk about bylaws, they are rules and regulations made by local government, local authorities, and even the public corporations. So rules and regulations made by local government, local authorities as transferred or given by the legislation or through the act of parliament establishing it. We call it bylaws. So these are the major forms of delegated legislation. Now, why do we have delegated legislations? What are the advantages of delegated legislation? Number one is delegated legislation allows flexibility of laws. That's flexibility in lawmaking that will not follow the usual or normal law-making process of first reading, second reading, and the rest of them. So to allow that flexibility in lawmaking, and also flexibility, especially in terms of emergency. Now, it allows local authorities to use their initiative to make rules and regulations based on their peculiarities and needs. So it allows local government to use their initiatives and make rules and regulations based on the present need of that society. Also, it reduces the burden of the legislature or on the legislature. You know, the legislature has a law to legislate on. There are many bills before the legislature to be discussed. So if the legislature should monopolize lawmaking process, everything about rules and regulations, the making of rules and regulations, it will be too much on them. So to reduce this burden, they had to give discretionary powers to make rules and regulations to other bodies other than the legislature. Also, it is important for emergency purposes so that we don't have to follow through the process of lawmaking that takes time. So the executive can come up and make a pronouncement during emergency period to address that issue for emergency. Now, it permits the use of expertise. Now, here we talk about people that are grounded, people that are professionals in that field will be the ones to come up with these rules and regulations. Then delegated legislation is argued to be easier to understand, because at times they may not have some of the jargons or legal terms of law made by the legislature. Also, a grand sense of belonging to the people, because the local authorities can actually come up with these rules and regulations which reflects the interests, the needs and wills of the people, and also the peculiarity of the people. So it gives them that sense of belonging. It saves cost, because the cost of making laws in the parliament is huge. It's very enormous. So it saves cost because it will require pronouncements from the appropriate body. Then it saves time. Why we say it saves time is that lawmaking process, the stages of passing bills into law, takes time. It takes months. Some will take years to pass. So, but delegated legislation that will require pronouncement, making of rules and regulations by the appropriate body who has been given such authority by the legislature, saves time. And that is why we say that it can address emergency when there is a state of emergency. Now, let's look at the problems associated with delegated legislation, the demerits. One, it can lead to abuse of power. Now, the agencies that have been given these discretions to make those rules and regulations can abuse the powers given to them. Then, it can give undue power to the executives. The reason being that, in fact, the organ of government that benefits more from this delegated legislation is the executive arm of government, because it gives the chief executive power to make emergency orders or pronouncement. It gives the agencies under the chief executive, under the executive powers to make rules and regulations. So at the end of the day, you say that it is responsible for increased and undue power of the executive, which can lead to dictatorship. Also, it can victimize the people, especially when there is unchecked making of these rules and regulations. So we can have arbitrary rules made by the chief executive or the executive arm of government that can victimize the people. Also, sometimes people are not consulted during the process of making this delegated legislation, that is rules and regulations. Also, it violates the principles of separation of powers. Principle of separation of powers says that powers are divided into the three arms of government in such a way that no other arm of government should perform the function or duty of the other arm of government. So when you have delegated legislation, it gives the executive the power to perform the lawmaking function, to carry out the lawmaking function of the legislature, which in turn violates the principle of separation of powers. Also, it violates the rule of law. Why it violates the rule of law is because the rule of law promotes separation of powers, recognizes independence of the arms of each arm of government, no interference. So when you have this, like we said, it can lead to victimization and abuse of powers, even affecting the rights of citizens. So the delegated legislation can lead to the violation of rule of law, but it violates separation of powers and can lead to infringement on the rights of citizens. Also, it is undemocratic. It is undemocratic because the representatives of the people, the legislatures, are the ones given the mandate and authority to make laws of the state. But when you have other bodies like the executive making laws, it violates that principle of democracy and separation of powers. Now, how can we check delegated legislation? We talk about control of delegated legislation. One, we have what we call parliamentary control. How does the parliament control delegated legislation? You know, delegated legislations come through the acts of parliament. The legislature gives them, transfers that act of making rules and regulations to the bodies. And also, the acts establishing some of these bodies are given, gives these bodies other than legislature, the powers to make some of these rules and regulations. Now, the legislature can amend the acts establishing this body or granting them such powers so they can limit the powers of these bodies. Also, the legislature has the power to also investigate, summon some of the heads of these agencies, including the executive, to question some of the powers exercised by them in exercise of delegated legislation. Also, we have judicial control. Now, when these pronouncements that we call it delegated legislations are made and are in violation of a particular law, or people feel victimized by this pronouncement, what will they do? They will go to court. And court can make pronouncements which may not be in favor of the body exercising that discretionary power. So the court, through judicial control, we can limit the tendency of abuse of power in delegated legislation. Also, we can have ministerial or administrative control. Now, when delegated legislation is coming from local authorities, like public corporations, which are under the minister. Now, the minister has the power to investigate, to supervise, to even call for explanation of some of these rules and regulations made by those bodies. So that is administrative control through supervision of it by the ministry. Then financial control can be used to control delegated legislation because the bodies established are financed. So also through that source of finance, they can be used to control these bodies exercising delegated power. Then public opinion, that is the expressed views of the people on government policy, the way people react to this pronouncement, these rules and regulations made by other bodies other than the legislature, can also be a source of control to delegated legislation, serving as a limit to this delegated legislation. Also, the mass media, through what the mass media, the way these rules and regulations are painted in the mass media or communicated in the mass media, and how people react in the mass media about delegated legislation, can be also a source or way of controlling delegated legislation. Now, we are going to take a practice test on our Examguide app. We are going to take a test. Now, you will see how it works. Now, this is SSCE. We are going to do the objective. Now, for the subject, we click on government. Now, for the year, we are taking it at random. Any year can come up. Now, let's select topic of interest. Now, I'm taking, I'll find delegated legislation in the organs. Okay, let me unselect all. Then I'm taking on the organs of government. That's where I can see delegated legislation. I click OK. Now, this is how it was. Get started. So, we're going to look at questions made. Questions on the topic we taught. Bylaws are made through A, executive instrument; B, presidential order; C, emergency order; D, delegated legislation, because it's part of the delegated legislation we taught you, a form of delegated legislation. Now, one form of delegated legislation is A, man-made laws; B, conventions; C, statutory instruments, one of the ones, those ones made by the ministers through the ministries. So it's not case laws. Now, one of the criticisms against delegated legislation is that A, it is not practiced in advanced countries. No, it's not what we say. It encroaches on parliamentary powers. Now, let's look at others. C, gives too much power to the judiciary. D, it promotes separation of powers. Of course, it does not promote separation. Now, it encroaches on parliamentary powers by giving other bodies the power to make rules and regulations. So it's an encroachment on the parliamentary powers. Now, look at this question. One of the following is not a reason for delegated legislation. 1, to ensure speedy legislation. B, to reduce the powers of the legislature. C, technicalities of modern legislation. D, the need for flexibility. Of course, it is not. The reason is not to reduce the powers of the legislature. We say one of the following is not. But if you look at to ensure speedy legislation, quick decision is one of the reasons. Technicalities of modern legislation, one of the reasons. The need for flexibility in laws, one of the reasons. And finally, one of the arguments against delegated legislation is that it wastes the time of legislation. It does not waste the time. B, it's against the principles of separation of powers. This is the answer, because it gives the executive the power to make laws, which is against separation of powers, that says that every arm of government should be independent in performing its function, and the other arms should not interfere with its functions. Thank you for participating in today's class. You can practice more questions using the Examguide app. The app scores and gives a detailed explanation of all questions at the end of your practice tests. You can learn a particular topic of interest with different modes like study mode, mark mode, and the practice mode. It also has other features that make learning fun. It is a must for all serious students. Download from www.examguide.com if you don't have it yet. See you in the next class. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share the videos to people that benefit from it. Bye.